In the early 1990s, video games were still treated like toys. Most consoles were built for kids. Internet gaming barely existed, and the idea that gaming could become one of the biggest entertainment industries in the world seemed impossible. Then two companies entered a war that would completely reshape the industry. One came from Japan, a company already dominant in consumer electronics and entertainment. The other came from America, a software giant with almost no experience making gaming hardware. This was more than a competition between consoles. It was a battle over the future of gaming itself. This is the story of PlayStation versus Xbox. The story really begins with Sony. In the early 1990s, Sony wasn't trying to dominate gaming. In fact, it almost never entered the industry at all. Originally, Sony was working with Nintendo on a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, but after disagreements over licensing and control, Nintendo suddenly backed out of the deal publicly, humiliating Sony in front of the entire industry. Most companies would have walked away. Sony did the opposite. It decided to build its own console. In 1994, the original PlayStation launched in Japan, and almost immediately, the industry changed. Unlike many consoles before it, the PlayStation targeted older audiences. Games became darker, more cinematic, and more ambitious. Titles like Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and Resident Evil transformed gaming from a niche hobby into mainstream entertainment. By the end of its life cycle, the original PlayStation sold over 100 million units globally, the first console ever to reach that milestone. Sony had gone from outsider to industry leader almost overnight. Then Microsoft noticed something dangerous: the living room. By the late 1990s, Microsoft dominated personal computing through Windows. But executives inside the company realized that gaming consoles were becoming increasingly powerful computers connected directly to televisions. And if Sony controlled the living room, Microsoft feared it could eventually threaten Microsoft's software dominance. So Microsoft made a decision that shocked the gaming industry. It would build its own console. When the original Xbox launched in 2001, many people underestimated it. Sony was already dominant with the PlayStation 2, which would eventually become the best-selling console in history with over 155 million units sold. Nintendo was still massive, and Microsoft had zero console experience. But Xbox introduced something that would change gaming forever: Xbox Live. Today, online multiplayer feels normal. But in the early 2000s, console online gaming was fragmented, unreliable, and often terrible. Microsoft treated online gaming like infrastructure. Xbox Live unified friends lists, voice chat, matchmaking, and online identities into one system. It turned gaming from an isolated activity into a connected social experience. And once players experienced that ecosystem, expectations changed permanently. Financially, Microsoft was willing to lose enormous amounts of money to compete. The original Xbox reportedly lost billions during its early years. Consoles were often sold at a loss, meaning Microsoft sometimes lost money on every unit sold. But Microsoft wasn't focused only on hardware profit. It was focused on ecosystem control, subscriptions, software, online services, long-term customer lock-in. That strategy would later become one of the most important ideas in the entire gaming industry. Meanwhile, Sony continued dominating globally with the PlayStation 2. The PS2 wasn't just a gaming console, it was also an affordable DVD player at a time when DVD adoption was exploding worldwide. That gave Sony a massive advantage because consumers felt they were buying both a gaming device and home entertainment system at once. At one point, Sony controlled nearly 70% of the console market. For a while, it looked unbeatable. But then came the generation that changed everything. In 2005, Microsoft launched the Xbox 360 1 year before Sony released the PlayStation 3. That head start mattered enormously. The Xbox 360 was cheaper, easier to develop games for, and heavily focused on online services. Games like Halo 3, Call of Duty 4, and Gears of War became defining online experiences for millions of players. Xbox Live exploded in popularity. By comparison, Sony struggled badly at first. The PlayStation 3 launched at $499 to $599 depending on the model, an extremely high price at the time. Developers also complained that its complex hardware architecture made game development difficult. For the first time, Sony looked vulnerable, and Microsoft took advantage aggressively. In the United States especially, Xbox became culturally dominant during the late 2000s. Online gaming communities centered around Xbox Live. Voice chat, achievement systems, and multiplayer competition became major parts of gaming culture. The war was no longer just about graphics. It was about ecosystems. Then, Sony adapted. Over time, the PlayStation 3 recovered through price cuts, stronger exclusives, and improved online services. Franchises like Uncharted, The Last of Us, and God of War helped Sony rebuild its reputation around cinematic storytelling and high-quality exclusives. That difference between the companies started becoming clearer. Xbox focused heavily on online infrastructure and services. PlayStation focused heavily on exclusive experiences and cinematic single-player games. And consumers began identifying strongly with one philosophy or the other. By the time the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One launched in 2013, the rivalry had evolved again. Microsoft made a major mistake. At launch, Xbox One messaging focused heavily on television integration, entertainment, and restrictive digital policies rather than games themselves. Many gamers reacted negatively, seeing Microsoft as disconnected from its audience. Sony responded ruthlessly. At E3 2013, Sony openly mocked Microsoft's complicated game-sharing restrictions in one of the most famous moments in gaming history. The clip went viral online, and almost instantly, public momentum shifted toward PlayStation. The PlayStation 4 went on to massively outsell the Xbox One globally, eventually surpassing 117 million units sold. Sony had reclaimed dominance. But behind the scenes, Microsoft was preparing another shift. Instead of focusing entirely on console sales, Microsoft started focusing on services and subscriptions, cloud gaming, cross-platform ecosystems, Game Pass. This was a major strategic change. Game Pass allowed players to access hundreds of games through a monthly subscription, often including new releases on launch day. Some analysts began comparing it to Netflix for gaming. Once again, Microsoft wasn't just competing over hardware anymore. It was trying to reshape the business model itself. Sony responded differently. Instead of aggressively chasing subscriptions first, Sony doubled down on exclusives, brand loyalty, and premium first-party experiences. Games like Spider-Man, Horizon Forbidden West, and God of War Ragnarok reinforced PlayStation's identity as the platform for cinematic blockbuster gaming. Financially, both companies now operate at enormous scale. Gaming generates tens of billions annually for both Sony and Microsoft. The global gaming industry itself now exceeds the film and music industries combined in revenue. And much of that modern structure was shaped directly by this rivalry. Today, the war looks completely different from the early console generations. Physical consoles matter less than ecosystems. Subscriptions matter more. Cloud infrastructure matters more. Cross-platform integration matters more. And increasingly, gaming is becoming less about owning hardware and more about staying inside a digital ecosystem. That shift heavily benefits Microsoft because of its massive cloud infrastructure through Azure. But Sony still maintains one of the strongest gaming brands and exclusive game libraries in the world. So the war continues, just on different terms. And maybe that's the real story behind PlayStation versus Xbox. Not simply who sold more consoles, but how two completely different strategies shaped modern gaming. Sony turned gaming into cinematic entertainment. Microsoft turned gaming into connected infrastructure. One focused on emotional experiences. The other focused on digital ecosystems. And together, they transformed gaming from a toy industry into one of the most powerful entertainment businesses on Earth. Today, billions of hours are spent inside worlds created, distributed, and monetized through systems these companies helped build. Online multiplayer, digital stores, subscription gaming, achievements, cloud saves, party chat, game streaming, Much of modern gaming culture traces back to decisions made during this rivalry, and even now, every new generation of gaming still revolves around the same question. Should gaming be defined by hardware or by the ecosystem behind it? Because that battle still hasn't been decided.